My name is Sarah, and I have been the family failure for 23 years, and I want to be precise about what that phrase means. Because failure in my family was not a word that was ever used directly, and was not a word that appeared in any conversation that I could point to and say, there, that is where it was said. And that is the moment I became what they decided I was. Failure in my family was communicated the way the most significant things in that family were always communicated, which is to say, through the quality of attention and the distribution of it. And what I learned before I was old enough to have language for the learning was that attention in the Calloway household moved toward my brother Mark, the way water moves toward the lowest point, which is to say, naturally and without decision, and with the specific indifference of a force that does not consider the terrain. It is leaving behind. My father was a man called Robert Calloway. And Robert Calloway had built a property development firm from a single-site acquisition in the late 80s into a portfolio that the industry press described with the words visionary and formidable, and that our family described at dinner tables and Christmas gatherings and the kind of events that families like ours use to confirm to themselves what they are with the specific warmth that people reserve for the thing they are most proud of, which in my father's case was not his children in the general sense, but was Mark in the specific sense, and Mark in the specific sense was everything my father recognized as an extension of himself. Which is to say, Mark was commercially minded and socially confident, and understood instinctively the language of rooms that my father considered worth being in. And I was none of those things. And I had known I was none of those things from the age of 8 when I had brought home a reading prize from school and placed it on the kitchen table, and my father had looked at it and said, "That is nice, Sarah," and had then spent the following 20 minutes talking to Mark about a business simulation game. Mark had won at school that week, and the reading prize had sat on the kitchen table and then been moved to a shelf and then been gone, and I had not mentioned it again. The dinner table was where it was most precise. I want to tell you about the dinner table, not as a general description, but as a specific account of a recurring experience that happened twice a week for 23 years on the evenings when the family ate together, and that had the same structure every time, which was that my father would ask Mark about his week, and Mark would answer, and my father would respond with the engaged interest of a man who is genuinely delighted by what he is hearing, and then my father would ask my mother something, and my mother would answer, and then the conversation would continue, and I would eat my dinner, and occasionally someone would remember that I was at the table and ask me something, and I would answer briefly, because I had learned that brief answers were the correct length for the attention available. And then the conversation would return to its natural direction, which was toward Mark. And I would finish my dinner and excuse myself and go to my room where I had books and the specific company of people who had been dead for centuries and who asked nothing of me and offered everything my father looked through me. I want to be precise about this too, because looking through someone is different from ignoring them, and it is different from disliking them, and it is the specific experience of being in a room with a person whose eyes move across you without registering that you constitute an object worth focusing on. And my father's eyes moved across me this way for 23 years. And I do not believe he was cruel, and I do not believe he was conscious of it. And I believe it was simply the way his attention organized itself, which was around the things it found interesting. And I was not a thing it found interesting. And that is a sentence that took me many years and significant professional help to be able to say in that specific, plain way without the weight of it requiring me to sit down. I left at 22, not dramatically, and not with a scene, and not with a speech about what the family had failed to give me. I left the way I did everything, which is quietly and with the specific efficiency of someone who has been preparing to be self-sufficient for long enough that self-sufficiency has become the natural condition. I moved to a city 3 hours away, and I took a position at a university library, and I built a life that was modest and precise and entirely mine, and I built it the way you build things. When you have learned that the building is for yourself and not for an audience, and I did not call home often, and home did not call me often. And the distance between us was a fact that everyone in the family had apparently decided to treat as a personality trait rather than a wound, and I treated it the same way because that was the convention. And conventions in my family had always been more powerful than truth. I heard about my father's diagnosis from my mother in a phone call that lasted 6 minutes. I heard about his death from Mark in a text message I drove to the funeral on a gray Thursday morning, and I sat in the back row of the chapel the way I had always sat in the back rows of Calloway family occasions, and I watched Mark deliver a eulogy that described our father as a man of profound warmth and generous vision, who had dedicated his life to his family and to building something that would outlast him. And the chapel received this with the nodding recognition of people who are hearing something confirmed. And I sat in the back row and I listened, and I thought about the reading prize on the kitchen table and the dinner table conversations and the eyes that moved across me without focusing. And I thought about the word family in Mark's eulogy and the specific way that word had always functioned in our house, which was as a description of a unit that included me nominally and excluded me practically, and I sat with all of that in the back row, and I did not cry, and I did not perform the not crying, and I simply sat. The lawyer's office was on the 4th floor of a building in the city center, and we sat in a room with a long table, and the lawyer, whose name was Gerald Moss, read the will with the professional efficiency of a man who has read many wills and who understands that the people in the room are not listening to the language, but to the distribution. And the distribution was what Mark had expected, which was the company and the portfolio and the Lakeview house and the investments and the accounts. And Mark sat across the table from me with the composed satisfaction of a man receiving a confirmation rather than a surprise. And Gerald Moss reached the end of the document, and he looked at his papers. And he paused in the way that pauses in legal readings are different from pauses in ordinary conversation, which is to say, with the specific weight of someone who has arrived at something that requires its own introduction. And he said there is one additional item not included in the main body of the estate documentation. And he said it was left with specific instructions regarding its delivery. And he reached into the folder in front of him and he removed an envelope, and the envelope was sealed. And my name was on the front in my father's handwriting, and Gerald Moss placed it on the table in front of me. And Mark looked at the envelope and looked at me, and I looked at my name written in my father's hand. And I thought about 23 years, and I thought about the reading prize, and I thought about the dinner table, and I thought about the back row, and I picked up the envelope, and I held it. And the room was very quiet, and I did not open it in that room, and I did not open it in the car, and I drove back to the hotel where I was staying, and I sat on the edge of the bed, and I held the envelope for a long time, and I thought about the specific handwriting of a man who had looked through me for 23 years, and who had nevertheless known my name precisely enough to write it on something he intended only for me. And I thought about what that meant and what it might contain. And I opened it. The envelope sat on the hotel bed beside me for 11 minutes before I opened it, and I know it was 11 minutes because I was looking at the clock on the bedside table. The way I look at clocks when I am doing something that requires a record, and the 11 minutes were not hesitation in the way that hesitation is usually understood, which is as uncertainty about whether to proceed. and they were instead the 11 minutes of a person who understands that the document in her hands is going to change the organization of something fundamental, and who is taking the time to be completely present before the change occurs. Because after the change, the before will not be available in the same way, and I wanted the before for a moment longer, and then I opened the envelope. The letter was 4 pages, handwritten on the same cream paper my father had used for correspondence. My entire life and the date at the top of the first page stopped me before I read anything else, because the date was 23 years ago. And 23 years ago, I was 8 years old. And 23 years ago was the year of the reading prize. And I sat with the date for a moment, and I thought about the reading prize on the kitchen table, and my father saying, "That is nice, Sarah," and turning to Mark. And I thought about what it means that on the same day or close to it, my father sat down and wrote 4 pages in his precise handwriting and addressed them to me and sealed them and gave them to a lawyer with instructions that they would reach me only after he was gone. And I thought that is either the most loving thing I have ever heard or the most complicated. And then I thought it is probably both. And I began to read my father wrote the way he spoke, which was directly and without ornament. And the directness of the letter was the first thing that surprised me, because the directness was not the directness of a man who had looked through his daughter for 23 years. It was the directness of a man who had been looking very carefully and had simply not known how to let the looking be visible. And he began by saying, "Sarah, I owe you an explanation that I have not been able to give you in person, because the person I am in rooms with you is not capable of saying what I need to say. And the person I am when I write is closer to honest, and I want to be honest with you now. While I still can." He wrote that he had recognized something in me from the time I was very small, and that what he recognized was the part of himself that he had spent his entire professional life suppressing, which was the part that read and thought and found the interior world more interesting than the exterior one, and that when he looked at me, he saw that part of himself reflected with a clarity that was uncomfortable in the specific way that mirrors are uncomfortable when they show you something you have decided not to look at. And he wrote that he had made a decision when I was very young that the world he had built, which was the world of deals and rooms and the performance of confidence, was not a world he wanted to pull me into. And that the way he had enacted this decision, which was through distance and silence and the deliberate direction of his professional attention toward Mark, was not the right way. And he knew it was not the right way. And he wrote that he was sorry, and he wrote it plainly, without the scaffolding of justification that apologies usually carry, and I sat on the hotel bed and I read the word "sorry" in my father's handwriting, and I thought about 23 years, and I thought it is too small, and I thought it is something, and I kept reading on the second page. The letter changed. My father wrote, "I want to tell you about something I built," and the sentence had a different quality from the sentences before it, which had the quality of confession. And this sentence had the quality of a man describing work he was proud of. And he wrote that in the year I was 8 years old, he had established a holding company in my name with the registration documents filed through his private lawyer, and that the company's name was SC Heritage Holdings, and that SC stood for Sarah Calloway, and that he had been building inside that company for 23 years, with the same attention and the same precision he brought to his own portfolio, except that his own portfolio was built for the performance of success. And SC Heritage Holdings was built for a different purpose, which he described as the purpose of giving you the ground to stand on. That I should have given you in person, and that I did not know how to give you any other way. I turned to the third page, and the third page contained the summary. I want to tell you about reading that summary, because reading it was one of the most disorienting experiences of my life. And disorienting is the accurate word because it did not produce one clear feeling. It produced many feelings arriving simultaneously and pulling in different directions. And the summary described a portfolio of commercial and residential properties across 4 cities and a stock holding in 7 companies and a cash position in 3 separate accounts. And the current estimated value of the combined assets had been calculated by the managing firm at my father's instruction 6 months before his death, which told me that 6 months before his death, my father had known what was coming and had made sure the number was current, and the number was not small, and the number was not the kind of number that a person who has spent 23 years working in a university library has a prepared category for. And I sat with the number, and I looked at it from several angles, and the number did not change, and I turned to the 4th page. My father wrote, "I know this cannot replace what I failed to give you, which was my attention and my time and the specific experience of being seen by your father in the rooms where it mattered, and I know that money is not an apology, and property is not the same as presence, and I am not offering you this as a substitution for those things, but as the evidence of what I was actually doing while I was failing to show you what I should have shown you." And he wrote that while Mark had been given things publicly and visibly, and with the warmth that I had watched travel across the dinner table in a direction that did not include me. My father had been building things privately and precisely and with the same warmth directed inward into documents and acquisitions, and a holding company whose name contained my initials and whose existence had been kept from everyone, including me, until this moment. And I read that sentence 3 times, and I thought about the dinner table and the reading prize and the back row of the chapel, and I thought about 23 years of a man building something in the dark for the person he could not look at in the light. At the bottom of the 4th page, beneath my father's signature, there was a name and a phone number. The name was Arthur Vance, beneath the name my father had written. Arthur has been managing SC Heritage Holdings since its founding, and he has been waiting for you to call, and he knows everything, and he will explain what I could not. And I sat on the hotel bed with the 4 pages in my hands and the number on the final page, and I looked at the name Arthur Vance, and I thought about 23 years of a man I thought had never seen me building an empire in my name, in the dark, and I picked up my phone and I found the number. And I looked at it for a moment, and I thought about the reading prize. And I thought about that as nice. Sarah, and I thought about the date at the top of the first page, which was 23 years ago, and which was the year of the reading prize. And I thought about what it means that both things happened in the same year. And then I pressed call. Arthur Vance answered on the 2nd ring. He said Arthur Vance, and his voice had the specific quality of someone who has been expecting a call for long enough that the expectation has become simply the condition of being available. And I said, "My name is Sarah Calloway." And I said, "I received a letter." And Arthur Vance said, "I have been waiting for this call for 23 years. Sarah." And the way he said my name was different from the way most people said my name, which was as a label. And the way Arthur Vance said it was as a designation, the specific word for a specific and significant thing. And I said, "My father's letter mentioned you." And Arthur said yes. And he said, "When would you like to meet?" And I said, "Tomorrow." And he said, "I will have everything ready." And he gave me an address in the financial district of the city where my father's firm had been headquartered and where I had not been since I left at 22. And I wrote the address on the hotel notepad. And I looked at it after the call ended. And I thought about 23 years of a man in an office somewhere building something in my name and waiting for a phone call that could only come after my father was gone. And I thought about what that kind of waiting feels like and what kind of loyalty it represents. and I turned off the light, and I lay in the hotel room in the dark, and I did not sleep for a long time. The office of Arthur Vance was not the kind of office that announced itself. The address led to a building whose entrance was understated in the specific way that significant things are sometimes understated. Which is to say that the understatement was itself a communication about the kind of business conducted inside, and the reception area had the quality of a room that has been arranged by someone who understands that restraint is more impressive than display. And I stood in it in the clothes I had driven 3 hours, in which were the clothes of a university librarian, which is to say practical, and considered and not designed for rooms like this. And I was aware of the contrast in the way that you are aware of a contrast when it is informative rather than embarrassing. And what it informed me was that I was standing at the edge of a world I had not known I belonged to. And Arthur Vance came through the interior door before the receptionist had finished offering me coffee, and he was 71 years old. And he had the bearing of a man who has spent decades in the company of significant decisions, and who has developed the specific stillness of someone for whom gravity is not a performance, but a condition. And he looked at me and he said, "Sarah," and he said, "You have your father's eyes." And I said, "I have been told. I have nothing of my father." And Arthur said, "Then you were told incorrectly." And he said, "Please come in the office." Was lined with filing systems that were not the digital kind. Physical files in cream folders, organized in a system whose logic I could not immediately read, but that had the quality of a system that has been maintained with complete consistency for a very long time. And Arthur sat across the desk from me, and he placed a single folder on the surface between us. And he said, "I want to begin with the overview, and then I will answer every question you have." And I said, "All right." And he opened the folder. The overview took 40 minutes. I want to be honest about what 40 minutes of that kind of information feels like when you are the person receiving it, which is that it feels like standing in a room you have been in your entire life and having someone turn on a light that reveals the room is significantly larger than you believed, and the furniture is different from what you thought you remembered, and the walls contain things that were always there and that you were not positioned to see. And Arthur walked me through the asset register of SC Heritage Holdings with the methodical precision of a man who has been preparing this presentation for 23 years, and who has therefore had time to make it exactly right. The portfolio contained 47 commercial properties across 4 cities. It contained residential holdings in 3 markets that had appreciated significantly over the period of acquisition. It contained equity positions in 9 companies, 2 of which were publicly listed. It contained cash reserves across 4 accounts that had been accumulating the income generated by the portfolio's assets for the periods between reinvestment decisions. And it contained something that Arthur saved for the last item in the register, and that he placed in front of me on a separate sheet with the specific deliberateness of someone who understands that certain pieces of information require their own moment. And the separate sheet was the title, Deed for a building called Vance Tower. And I looked at the address on the deed, and I looked at Arthur, and I said, "This is my brother's building?" And Arthur said, "It is your building." And he said, "Calloway Group has been a tenant since the building was acquired 14 years ago." And I thought about Mark in the lawyer's office with the composed satisfaction of a man receiving a confirmation. And I thought about the way Mark had looked at the sealed envelope with my name on it, and Arthur said, "Your father acquired this building specifically and deliberately," and he said it was not a passive investment. And he said, "Your father knew where Mark would establish the firm, and he made sure that the ground under it belonged to you." And I sat with that for a moment, and I thought about my father at the dinner table looking at Mark with the engaged interest of a man delighted by what he was hearing. And I thought about what was happening simultaneously in the part of my father that did not show at the dinner table. And Arthur said, "Sarah, your father did not just leave you money. And he said he left you the power to decide your family's future. And he said every decision about every asset in this portfolio is yours to make." And I said every decision, and Arthur said everyone. And he reached into the folder and he removed a single document and he placed it on the desk. And he said, "There is one matter that requires your attention within the next 30 days. And I looked at the document, and the document was the lease renewal for Calloway Group's occupancy of Vance Tower. And the current term expired in 30 days, and the renewal had not been signed because the renewal required the signature of the building's owner, and the building's owner was me. And I looked at the document, and I thought about 23 years of back rows and dinner tables and reading prizes and the word failure used in the specific way that does not require the word to be spoken. And I thought about Mark delivering the eulogy about the perfect father in the chapel on the gray Thursday morning. And I thought about the sealed envelope and the date 23 years ago. And I looked at the lease renewal for Calloway Group. And I said, "Arthur," and he said, "Yes." And I said, "What happens if I don't renew?" And Arthur looked at me with the expression of a man who has been waiting 23 years for the right person to ask the right question. And he said, "Then Mark has 30 days to find his firm a new home." And I picked up the lease renewal and I looked at it for a long time and I did not sign it. And I put it back on the desk and I said, "I need to think." And Arthur said, "Of course." And he said, "You have time." And I said, 30 days. And he said, "Yes." And I said, "That is enough." And Arthur almost smiled. And I thought about the reading prize and I thought about that is nice. Sarah and I picked up the folder and I stood up and I said, "Thank you." "Arthur," and he said, "Sarah," and I said, "Yes." And he said, "Your father was not a good father." And he said, "But he was a man who knew exactly what he had." And he said he just did not know how to say it while he was alive. And I said, "I know." And I said, "That is the part I am still deciding what to do with." And Arthur nodded, and I walked out of the office and into the city that I had apparently owned pieces of for 23 years without knowing it. And I stood on the pavement, and I thought about 30 days, and I thought about Mark. And I thought about my father writing SC for Sarah Calloway on a company registration 23 years ago in the year of the reading prize. And I thought about what I was going to do with all of it, and I did not have the answer yet. But I had 30 days, and I had Arthur Vance, and I had a folder, and I had the specific quality of someone who has spent 23 years learning to be self-sufficient in the absence of everything, and who has just discovered that the absence was not what it appeared to be. And I walked back to my car, and I drove to the hotel, and I sat at the desk, and I opened the folder, and I began to read everything from the beginning. I drove to Vance Tower on a Thursday morning, and I parked in the public garage on the adjacent street. And I sat in the car for a moment before I went in. And I thought about the last time I had been in a building that my family considered theirs, which was the Lakeview house at my father's funeral reception, where I had stood near the window with a cup of tea and watched the room operate around the specific center of gravity that had always been Mark, and I thought about what it means to walk into a building that the room does not know belongs to you. And I got out of the car, and I walked to the entrance. Vance Tower was 12 stories of glass and steel in the part of the financial district where the buildings understand their own significance and communicate it through proportion and material and the specific quality of light that good architecture produces when it knows what it is doing. And I walked through the entrance in my gray cardigan and my flat shoes and my bag that contained a notebook, an Arthur's folder, and a pen. And the lobby received me the way lobbies receive people who do not look like they belong to the building's primary demographic, which is to say, the security desk registered my presence and assessed my category and returned to its other functions. And I walked to the building directory on the wall, and I found the floor I was looking for, and I took the lift to the 8th floor, and I stepped out into the reception area of Calloway Group. The reception area of Calloway Group had been designed by someone who understood that the first room a client enters does the work of establishing whether the firm deserves their confidence, and the design was doing that work effectively with its dark wood, and its restrained lighting, and its receptionist, who had the composed professional manner of someone selected for the specific quality of making visitors feel that they have arrived at a place that was expecting them. And I stood in the reception area in my gray cardigan, and I said, "I am here to look at the building management information." And I said, "I am from the property administration office," and the receptionist looked at me and assessed my category, the way the lobby had assessed it, and said, "Of course," and directed me to the building services contact point. And I said, "Thank you." And I did not go to the building services contact point, and I stood near the window that looked into the main office floor. And I looked through the glass. Mark was in his office, which was the glass-walled office at the corner of the floor. That the corner offices, in buildings like this, are always given to the person whose title requires the corner. And he was standing behind his desk, and he was talking to someone on the other side of the desk, and the talking had the quality of talking that is not a conversation, but a delivery. And the person on the other side of the desk had the posture of someone receiving a delivery they have not requested and cannot refuse. And I watched my brother Mark Calloway in his corner office in the building I owned, and I thought about the dinner table and the eulogies and the lawyer's office and the composed satisfaction of a man receiving a confirmation. And I watched him, and he looked up once toward the window where I was standing, and his eyes moved across me the way my father's eyes had moved across me for 23 years, which is to say, without focusing, and I noted this without surprise, because I had been this category of person my entire life, and I was not yet a different category of person to anyone in this building. And Mark looked back at the person across his desk and continued the delivery, and I continued watching. My mother was in the open office area near the far wall. I had not expected. My mother and I stood for a moment with the specific feeling of encountering something you had not prepared for, and I looked at her through the glass, and she looked smaller than she had at the funeral. And she was sitting at a desk that was not the desk of a principal. And she was looking at a screen with the expression I had seen at the dinner table for 23 years, which was the expression of a woman managing her experience of a room that she has decided she cannot change. And I thought about the phone call where she told me about my father's diagnosis and the 6 minutes it had lasted. And I thought about her at the funeral reception, standing near Mark, with the specific proximity of someone who has transferred their center of gravity from one Calloway to the next. And I looked at my mother in the office of the building I owned, and I felt something that was not quite anger and not quite sorrow, but something that contained both and that I did not have a clean word for. I walked to the lift lobby and I pressed the button. And while I waited, I looked at the maintenance crew working on the lobby's light fixtures. 2 men in gray uniforms with the specific focused attention of people who understand that the building requires consistent care regardless of what the building's tenants are doing on the floors above. And I thought about Arthur's asset register and the 47 properties and the title deed with my name as the registered owner. And I thought about what it means to own the building that the maintenance crew is caring for, and what it means to own the floors above, and the light fixtures, and the lobby floor, and the corner office with the glass walls, where my brother was delivering something to someone who had not requested it. And I thought about the word owner, and what the word actually means when you are standing in the thing you own, wearing a gray cardigan, that the lobby assessed as a category that did not belong. And I thought it means that the assessment was wrong and has always been wrong, and the assessors simply did not have the correct information. The expansion party invitation was on the reception desk. I had seen it when I spoke to the receptionist, and I had noted it without reacting. And it was a physical card printed on heavy cream stock that said Calloway Group Legacy Celebration and a date that was 3 weeks away, and a venue that was the main floor of Vance Tower, which the invitation described as our home for the future. And I stood in the lift lobby and I thought about the lease renewal document on Arthur's desk unsigned. And I thought about the 30 days. And I thought about my brother in his corner office planning a party to celebrate the future of a tenancy that was under review. And the lift arrived and I stepped in and the doors closed and I took out my phone and I called Arthur. He answered on the first ring. I said, Arthur. And he said, Sarah. And I said, I have seen enough. And Arthur said, and I said, send the formal notice. And I said, the lease renewal is under review. And Arthur said, I will send it this afternoon. And I said, thank you. Arthur and I ended the call, and the lift reached the lobby, and the doors opened, and I walked through the entrance and back to the parking garage. And I sat in my car, and at 3:47 that afternoon, my phone showed a message from a number I did not have saved. And the message said, this is Mark Calloway. And I need to speak with the owner of this building immediately regarding the lease review notice we just received. And I read the message, and I put my phone in my bag, and I started the car, and I drove back to the hotel. And I thought about 30 days, and I thought about the lease, and I thought about the expansion party invitation on the reception desk. And I thought about the word home in the phrase, our home for the future. And I thought about what home means when the person who owns it has not yet decided what she is going to do with the decision her father left her. And I parked at the hotel, and I went upstairs, and I opened Arthur's folder, and I sat at the desk, and I began to think very carefully about what came next. Arthur had arranged the meeting for 10 o'clock on a Tuesday morning, and I arrived at 9:15 because arriving first was not a strategy. It was simply who I was and who I had always been. And I sat in the inner office in the chair that faced the door, and I placed the folder on the desk in front of me, and I thought about the letter and the reading prize and the date, 23 years ago, and I thought about the dinner table and the back row of the chapel, and I thought about Mark's message on my phone, which had been followed by 4 more messages over 3 days, each one slightly more pressured than the last. And I had not responded to any of them because Arthur had responded on behalf of SC Heritage Holdings with the professional efficiency of a firm that understands that the correct response to pressure is precision, and the meeting had been set, and the meeting was now. And I turned the chair so that it faced away from the door, and I looked at the wall, and I waited. I heard them before the door opened. Mark's voice in the corridor had the quality it always had, which was the quality of a voice that has been told for long enough that it is the most important sound in any room that it has stopped considering whether the room agrees. And he was saying something to Arthur about the inconvenience of the review timeline and something about the unprofessional way the notice had been delivered. And Arthur was responding in the specific way Arthur responded to everything, which was with the unhurried precision of a man who has never found pressure to be a useful substitute for accuracy. And then the door opened, and I heard Mark come into the room, and I heard him stop. And I heard him say, "Where is the owner?" And Arthur said, "She is here." And Mark said, "I don't see anyone." And Arthur said, "She is in the chair." And Mark took 2 steps further into the room, and I heard my mother come in behind him, and then I turned the chair around the room. did the thing that rooms do when the information arriving in them exceeds the categories available to process it. And the thing it did was go completely silent. And Mark looked at me. And I looked at Mark. And Mark's face went through several things in quick succession. The first was non-recognition, because I was in a chair in an office that belonged to a context his mind had not filed me in, and the second was recognition, and the third was a recalibration that I could see happening in real time as his understanding of the situation revised itself from inconvenient landlord to something it did not yet have a complete category for. And my mother looked at me with the expression I had seen at the dinner table for 23 years, except that this time the expression had something additional in it, which was not surprise and was not confusion, and was something that looked like it had been waiting. Mark said, "Sarah," and I said, "Good morning, Mark." And he said, "What are you doing here?" And I said, "I own the building." Mark, and he looked at Arthur and looked at me. And he said, "What does that mean?" And I said, "It means that SC Heritage Holdings is the registered freeholder of Vance Tower, and that SC Heritage Holdings is my company, and that I am therefore the owner. Your lease renewal notice was sent to?" And Mark looked at the folder on the desk, and he looked at the chair I was sitting in. And he said, "Sarah, this is not funny." And I said, "I agree. It is not." And I said, "Please sit down." He sat down the way people sit down. When they are not sure, the sitting down is not a concession. My mother sat beside him, and she was looking at me with the expression that had something waiting in it. And she said, "Sarah," and I said, "Hello, Mum." And she said, "Your father?" And I said, "Yes." Mark said, "Sarah, I don't know what Dad told you or what some lawyer has convinced you, but you need to stop this review and sign the lease." And I said, "Mark, I am going to show you something." And I opened the folder and I placed the SC Heritage Holdings asset register on the desk between us. And I said this company was established 23 years ago. And I said it was established in my name by our father. And I said it has been operating and acquiring assets for 23 years under the management of Arthur Vance. And I said the portfolio currently includes 47 commercial properties. And Vance Tower is one of them. And I said, Calloway Group has been a tenant in my building for 14 years. And Mark looked at the asset register and he looked at the establishment date. And he looked at me and he said, 23 years. And I said, yes. And he said, when I was 8 years old, and I said the same year I won the reading prize. And Mark looked at the table and I said, the year Dad said that is nice. Sarah, and turned to talk to you about a simulation game, and the room was quiet, and my mother looked at her hands. Mark said, Sarah, this is about the reading prize, and his voice had the specific quality of a man reducing a situation to something manageable. And I said, no. And I said, it is about 23 years of a man building an empire for one daughter, while the other was told she was the failure. And I said, it is about the dinner table and the back row, and the sealed envelope and the date on the letter, which is the same date as the reading prize. And I said, it is about the fact that while you were being given things, I was being built for. And I said, I wanted you to understand that before we discuss the lease. And Mark looked at the asset register, and he looked at Arthur, and he looked at me, and something moved through his expression that was not the composed satisfaction of the lawyer's office and was not the arrogance of the glass-walled corner office, and was something closer to the specific feeling of a person who has just understood that the map they have been using is not the map of the territory they were actually in. I said I am reviewing the Calloway Group lease, because the firm's financial performance over the past 8 quarters does not meet the covenant requirements for a long-term renewal on an asset of this value. And I placed the financial summary on the table beside the asset register. And I said, The occupancy generates below market return. And I said the tenant's management decisions represent a reputational risk to the building. And I said I have 3 alternative tenants who have expressed interest in this floor at a rate significantly above Calloway Group's current terms. And Mark said, "Sarah, you cannot evict your own family's company." And I said, "Mark, I am the owner of this building." And I said, "The family of the tenant is not a relevant factor in a commercial lease decision." And Mark said, "Sarah, stop this." And his voice had lost the delivery quality and had the quality instead of something less managed. And he said, "This is Dad's legacy." And I said, "No." And I said, "This building is my father's legacy." And I said, "Calloway Group is your legacy." And I said, "Those are 2 different things." And I said, "One of them belongs to me." Mark said, "What do you want?" And I said, "I want you to give me a reason." And he said, "A reason for what?" And I said, "A reason why I should not terminate the lease." And Mark looked at me across the desk in the office of the company my father had built in my name for 23 years, and he said, "Sarah, please." And I said, "You have 24 hours. And I closed the folder, and I said, "I will hear your case tomorrow morning." And I said, "Bring whatever you think is relevant." And I said, "Good morning, Mark." And I stood up, and I picked up the folder, and I walked out of the inner office, and I did not look back. And Arthur fell into step beside me in the corridor, and he said that was precise. "Sarah," and I said, "Arthur," and he said yes. And I said, what did my father think was going to happen when I finally sat in that chair and Arthur was quiet for a moment? And then he said, "He thought you would know exactly what to do." And I said, "And did he think I would evict them?" And Arthur said he thought you would decide. And he said he trusted you to decide correctly. And I said, "And what is correctly?" And Arthur said, "That is the question he left for you to answer." And I walked out of the building into the city that I owned pieces of. And I thought about 24 hours, and I thought about the reading prize. And I thought about what correctly means when the person who trusted you to find the answer is no longer available to tell you if you got it right. Mark called at 11 and at 2 and at 7, and I put the phone face down each time. Not from cruelty, but because I had not finished thinking, and I have never answered a question before I finished thinking, regardless of the pressure being applied to the thinking, and I was not going to begin. Now I drove to the cemetery at 6:40 in the morning before the city had decided what kind of day it was going to be. And I stood in front of my father's stone in the specific quiet of early morning cemeteries, which is the quiet of a place that has made its peace with the fact that the most important conversations happen after the opportunity for response has passed. And I looked at his name and I said out loud, "I understand what you were doing." And I said, "I am not certain it was the right way." And I said, "But I understand it." And I stood for a while with the stone and the quiet and the early light. And then I drove to Arthur's office. Mark arrived alone. No lawyer and no mother, and none of the composed satisfaction that had been on his face in the lawyer's office when he believed he was receiving a confirmation. And he sat across from me at Arthur's conference table, and he looked like someone who has spent 24 hours at the edge of a significant drop and who has come to the meeting not to negotiate, but to ask a question. He does not know how to frame. And I waited, and he said, "Sarah," and I said, "Yes." And he said, "The employees." And he said, "There are 64 people whose jobs depend on what you decide today." And he said, "I know I have not managed the firm the way Dad would have wanted." And he said, "I know I have not been what he built it to be." And he said, "But those 64 people have nothing to do with any of that." And Mark looked at his hands on the table and he said, "I will step down." And he said, "I will do whatever you need me to do." And he said, "Please do not let them pay for my failures." And I looked at my brother across the table and I thought about the dinner table and the simulation game and 23 years of a center of gravity that had never once shifted in my direction. And I thought about what it costs a person to say, please, in the specific way Mark had just said it, which is the way that costs everything. And I said, Mark, and he looked up and I said, I am not going to destroy it. And something left his face that had been there for the entirety of the meeting. And he said, thank you. And I said, I am going to absorb it. And he said, what? And I said, Calloway Group is going to be merged into SC Heritage Holdings. And I said, the operational leadership transfers to me. And I said, you will have a role. And I said, it will be defined and limited. And I said, those 64 people will be fine. And Mark looked at the table and he nodded and he said, okay. And he said, Sarah? And I said, yes. And he said, I am sorry for the dinner table. And I said, I know. And he said, I did not see you. And I said, I know that too. And we sat with that for a moment. And then I stood up and I said, Arthur will send the merger documents today. And I picked up the folder and I left. My mother came to the hotel that evening and she sat in the chair by the window and she said, he loved you the most. Sarah and I looked at her and she said, I know, that is the thing that makes the least sense, given everything. And she said, but it is true. And she said, you were the one he could not look at directly. And I said, because I reminded him of himself. And she said, yes. And she said, the part of himself he considered too soft for the world he had built. And she said he was terrified that the world would do to you what it does to soft things. And I said, so he made himself the world. And she looked at her hands and she said, yes. And she said, and he built you an exit from it at the same time. And I thought about that for a long time after she left. And I thought about the specific cruelty and the specific love contained in the same decision. And I thought about my father writing SC on a company registration in the year of the reading prize. And I thought that being loved in a language you cannot hear is still being loved. And I thought that it is also not enough. And I thought that both things can be true. Simultaneously, I moved into the corner office on a Friday morning. The office that had been Mark's, and that was now mine in the building. That had always been mine. And I stood at the window and I looked at the city that I owned pieces of. And I thought about the university library and the flat-facing window and the box that had traveled with me through 3 cities. And I opened the box and I took out the reading prize and I placed it at the center of the marble desk. It was small. It was 23 years old. It was the first thing anyone had ever given me that my father had seen and noted and responded to, not with words, but with 4 pages and a company registration. And 23 years of building in the dark, I sat in my chair in my office, in my building, and for the first time in 23 years, someone in this family finally saw me, and that someone was him.